We are now beginning the new session for the afternoon. Professor David Meyer is already with us. And only a few words of introduction. He obtained a PhD in religious studies in Leuven, Katholieke Universiteit Leuven. And now he's a professor in Cardinal Meyer Center for Judaic Studies at the Gregorian Pontifical University in Rome. We were yesterday for a moment also there. And he also teaches in Leuven and other places in the world. The most important thing is his book about Midrashic hermeneutics as theological medium of 2022. So please, the floor is yours, and we are ready to hear your paper.
Thank you very much. Let me first of all maybe just share my screen before we start, and I think that will make the presentation easier. And that should take half a second. And
yes, we are able to see it.
Okay, wonderful. Right, so let me first of all apologize for not being in presence with you and just being online only. I hope that somehow, despite the distance, the topic of my presentation will remain close to the theme of this conference. So the theme of this part of this afternoon is about reception. It's about the reception of biblical passages in which motions raise questions and concern for Jewish and Christian exegesis. And in order to illustrate this topic from a rabbinic perspective, let me just make maybe two introductory remarks. The first one is that I have chosen to narrow down the perspective to only one single text and one single topic that I will try to present to illustrate really one rabbinic exegetical concern. And the reason I'm doing this is because it's very well known that the rabbinic tradition is extremely diverse. It's made out of a mosaic of diverse opinions. And it has been claimed very often that it's very difficult to actually find coherence within the whole body of rabbinic writing. It's almost impossible to make general statements. And as such, I felt it was much safer to only look at very specific texts in a sort of an atomistic approach, if you want, which of course means that there won't be any wider conclusions. The second remark is just to say I have taken some sort of leeway and liberty with the historical brackets, which were referred to in the brief for these sessions, which made explicit reference to the first 4 centuries of the Common Era. But the text I have chosen is a little bit later, or at least possibly a little bit later, at least in terms of the Midrashic collection in which it appears. But while the collection as such, the rabbinic collection in which it is found, is later, that actually says very little about the origin of the individual text that you find within that collection. And therefore, because of the textual atomistic approach I have taken, I felt that that little bit of leeway was acceptable. So let me go into some specifics really about the text that I will try to present. Now, the Midrash that I want to present comes from a collection which has come to be known as Echazuta, which is a small collection of Midrashic thoughts on the Book of Lamentation. It's a text that was published very late in 1894 only by Solomon Buber, the great editor of rabbinic text, after he discovered in the De Rossi library 2 manuscripts that had never been published before. And he called it Echazuta to kind of differentiate it, if you want, from Echa Rabbah, which is a most well-known collection about the Book of Lamentation rabbinic interpretation. Now, about those texts, we don't know that much about Echazuta as such. What we know is that the collection was known to the author of the Rokeach, which is a 12th century halachic and ethical work by Rabbi Eliezer ben Yehuda of Worms. We also know that somehow the compiler, the editor of the Yalkut Shimoni, who's called Shimon Adarshan in the 13th century, knew that text. But again, after having said that, it says almost nothing to the earlier origin of the individual text within that collection. And some scholars have certainly shared the opinion that the origin of those texts inside can be drawn back to a much earlier period, for some according even to late antiquity. So as you can guess, the topic of the Midrashic text that we're going to look at is about lamentation. And in particular, it's about one very specific motion in lamentation, which is that of the human tears. The human tears. This is what interested me. This is for me a topic that has really imposed itself in the time in which we live. We are, as we know, we are faced with destructions and war and death on all sides. And the language of lamentation, I think, takes a new urgency, and certainly it reflects my mood, and maybe it reflects yours as well. And so I hope that the language of lament that we're going to study a little bit might have something really to teach us. Now, the Midrash I will present focuses on the reality of human tears in two different aspects. First, the human tears as emotion, but also the human tears as an emotion. And the tears, as such, have a sort of a double characteristics. The first one is as emotion. It's a kind of something that is rolling down the cheeks. It's a sort of an up-down motion because of gravity. The other thing that interests me there is the smallness. It's the smallest human motion we can think of almost. Maybe the blink of an eye would have been another option. But what's fascinating about the text we're going to look at is that the Midrash is going to invert these two dynamics. It's going to transform the up-down motion into a down-up theology. So there's a sort of an inversion of the motion. And the Midrash is also going to transform somehow the smallness of that human motion to make of it a sort of a giant theological overture in a way. And it is really this double inversion that I would like to try and present today. So let's now face the text of the Midrash. You have it here. It's the Parma manuscript, which you have with a little arrow where the text starts. It's folio 186V and 187R. In the Buber edition, it's 118. And it's essentially is a commentary to Jeremiah 8:23, Mi yiten roshi mayim ve'ini mekor dim'ah, which in the King James translation is, oh, that my head were waters and mine eyes a fountain of tears. Now, the Midrash is actually quite long, and it is too long really to be read and studied step by step together today within the time that we have. So what I have chosen to do is to start with a presentation of its structure, and as we go along to focus on some of its key features, and I hope that in a way that will suffice to do justice to that text. Now, let me start with the structure here quickly of the text. It's essentially is a part of a series of interpretation on two verses, Jeremiah 8:23, Mi yiten roshi mayim, and on 8:21, okay, which we know as well, Kadarti shama echezikatni. Now, what is interesting, you have the text in yellow and in green, but what is interesting is what comes after, which is in the brackets that you have, which in a way introduces the Midrash that I'm going to focus on, which is on the Jeremiah 8:21 section. There is here a rhetorical formula that introduces a series of Midrashim, and I want to spend a little bit of time on this because here is what it says. אילולא שהכתוב מדבר היה הלשון האומרו חייב לחתכו איברים איברים. If it was not, because there is a verse that says what I'm about to say, the tongue that would say those words would need to be cut off piece by piece. So this is a very strong rhetorical formulation by which we struck, if you want, by the violence in a way of the formula. And it certainly draws the attention of the reader to maybe something extraordinary or at least something daring that is going to be said. And that, of course, triggered my intention. Now that we are warned, if you want, about maybe the audacity of the teaching that's going to follow, let's see what this is about. So you'll see in red and in green what I've already mentioned, the rhetorical formula, which is there. and then the quote from Jeremiah, the beginning of the quote from Jeremiah. And in blue, this is where the Midrash I want to focus on starts, and it starts with a parable, a mashal lechacham. So this is like the case of a sage, a wise person. And the Midrash unfolds the story, said, what kind of sage is that? This is a sage that never saw grief in his life. But suddenly his son dies. And unaware as to what to do in front of the sudden grief, the sage calls on his students, the Talmidim, and he asks them and he says, show me the motions of mourning. Show me the posture of mourning. Now, you see what happened here with the kadarti from the word of Jeremiah. The kadarti is first turned into an emotion, as you would expect in the translation. The darkening becomes a symbol for the mourning, but also the term becomes, because of the polysemy of the term and its relationship to the root gadar, not just kuf dalet resh, but gimel dalet resh, which is to guard, to fence, to measure. In a way, it becomes the entry point to talk about the measurement of grief, and from that point of view, the halachic, legal dynamic of what grief is. And this is what really the Midrash now comes to do. It's going to start listing the motion and posture of grief that the students are going to teach their master. And they list 5, which you can see here on the screen. It says, first of all, a mourner, koreab gadav, he torns his garment. And then Yoshev domem, he sits alone with a sad face. And then he ofech mitato, he turns around his bed and he sits upside down. Lovesh chorim, he wears dark. And then finally, boche vayom uvalayla, the mourner cries day and night. And as you can imagine, of course, what's happening with the text is for each of the motion of this ritual, if you want, of Avelut, the sage is answering the student and he says, Afani, 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 I will do the same, I will do the same, I will do the same. Now, as expected, of course, the Midrash now is going to bring not just the mashal, but the second part of it, the nimshal of the mashal, so the signified, if you want, of the parable. And it starts in a way that is very expected. Echacham ze Elohim, the sage, it is God, and it uses a passage from Proverbs 3:19, in which the words Adonai and Chochmah are put together to prove that this is the Chacham is Elohim. And then it gives the context in the Nimshal. Since the temple was destroyed and calamity befell the people, this is the equivalent to the death of the son. And God is asking the angel as a kind of parallel to the master asking the students, and he's asking the angel, and he's saying, just show me how human beings are grieving. What are their motions of grief? Now, rather than just leaving it there for the reader to make it up and understand how it works, the Midrash is really developing a strong hermeneutical reading of the Nimshal, and it gives very much details of every motion of Avelut, every motion of grief, and it's going to find the appropriate biblical quote to root the affirmation that God is doing the same thing as human. So you see how it works. It goes back to Korea Begadav. He tears his garment, and it's going to use Lamentation 2:16-18. God destroys, God is tearing down the walls of the city. You can see the image, tearing down the garment, tearing down the walls. It works quite well. Then we have God Yoshev lehetzmo, that's Lamentation 3:28. Let him sit alone and in silence. And then we have the kofe mitato, he inverts the couch. This is from the verse of Daniel this time, where it talks about the thrones that were cast down and overturned. You see, I have added something in gray, in smaller. This is another motion of grief. I'll leave it for now because it appears in the Nimshal, but it doesn't appear in the Mashal. So to avoid confusion, I'm going to ignore this little piece in the middle. Then God wears darkness, and here the Midrash is using the passage from Isaiah 53. I will dress up the heaven in blackness. And finally, of course, Boche vayom uvalayla, God cries day and night, and this is Jeremiah 8:23. Now, there's a lot of things we can say about the actual usage of the quotes here, but I would like to point maybe to 2 interesting features which are about the hermeneutical demonstration of how God is really imitating human motion. The first one is in red here, Lamentation 3:28. In its original context, of course, this is not about God at all. This is about a person who is in total distress and who is waiting for God's salvation. And similarly, this last one, Jeremiah 8:23, it is not about God. This is about Jeremiah, who is really lamenting. So if we take those two quotes in their context and we realize it is not about God, then there's something quite astonishing that the Midrash really is doing. It is literally abolishing any distance between humans and God. It's not just that God is learning from the human motions and postures about Avelut, about mourning, but in a way, God captures and God seizes. You almost want to say God steals a human verse and he makes it his own. And this, in a way, of course, is quite daring. Now, the Midrash here does not stop here. And what is fascinating is that the Midrash is now going to create, from a literary and hermeneutical perspective, is going to create its own movement, its own motion. There's a sort of a midrashic literary motion that echoes the human motion that God is imitating human posture. So it's a motion within a motion. Now, after having concluded with the Nimshal that we've seen that declares that God is crying day and night, the Midrash questions again the affirmation, and you have it in red, the square in red, mi boche, who is crying, and kivyachol, as if it were possible to say so, I would say, God is crying. And then the Midrash in blue, domeh lachacham. Now, it starts with another mashal, a secondary mashal. Now, you can see here the dynamic of the motion of the Midrash itself as a sort of a literary structure. It starts with the first mashal, mashal 1, which leads to mashal, nimshal 1. Then the Midrash uses the conclusion of the first nimshal to ask another question, mi boche, and that in itself creates a secondary mashal, which will lead to a secondary nimshal. There's a sort of a movement within the text from a hermeneutical perspective, which I believe amplify the thematic movement of the Midrashic text. Now, let's look at this secondary mashal. Domeh lachacham, it's similar to the case of a sage, and this time we are told this sage has two sons, and every morning he takes them to the house of study, and every evening he takes them to the pub, to the tavern. But then suddenly they both die. And what happened then is in the secondary mashal, the sage still goes every morning to the house of study, and he sits there alone and he cries. And every evening he goes to the tavern and he sits alone and he cries. It becomes a very emotional image, if you want, of pure pain, of pure loss. And now what we notice is that the text of the Midrash, the motions of Avelut that were mentioned in the first mashal, in the first parable, which listed all those postures, well, those motions of Avelut have been removed. And by being removed, they have turned from motion to emotion, and the emotion of grief. So in a way, I would say the Midrash creates its new motion, that is the vanishing of the posture of Avelut. And it becomes, I think, legitimate to wonder if it is not the vanishing motions that create really that space for emotion. Now, as expected, we now turn to the second nimshal, and it starts in yellow, Kach keshecharba Tzion v'Yerushalayim. So we talked about the site. Now, same thing when Zion and Jerusalem were destroyed, which are here used for the two sons. And we have God in the morning wakes up and goes to Zion, to the house of study. That's the equivalent of the house of study. And in the evening, God goes to Jerusalem, which interestingly is kind of going to the tavern. And each time God goes there and says, Velo haya motzeh sham boreh, but he couldn't find his sons there. And so the reader is left with this total sense of absence. God here faces the absence with nothing around. He faces the loss. God faces his own loneliness. And it is almost as if when the people of God are no more, the sons have disappeared. When Zion and Jerusalem were destroyed, everything vanished. When the people of God are no more, no one is left to teach God the motion of grief. And that's why in the secondary Nimshal, the grief have disappeared. The motions of it, the postures are not even mentioned. It's as if there was a kind of a double loss. There is the loss of the sons, but there's also the loss through the son of the knowledge. There's no more knowledge of the motion of grief, and that leaves an unbearable void. And the Midrash ends by recalling the only thing that is left is really the movement of the tears. I will cry day and night for the slain of the daughter of my people. So it's on this very depressing note in a way that the Midrash ends. Now, let me try to somehow attempt at a conclusion. We almost reached the time, so I just need just 2 more minutes, really.
Yes.
What did the Midrash try to achieve? What did it try to do? So from a Midrashic thematic, the first thing is the Midrash presents a God that learns motion from human practices and human experiences. In a way, this is an inversion of the imitatio Dei that we used to. We are B'Tselem Elohim and we imitate God. Here we have the other way around. It's God who imitates us. And I think this kind of leaves space for anthropological theology, which here would differentiate from theological anthropology with the order of the words having their importance. And of course, that inversion is something that is very audacious, and that maybe is why we have this warning at the beginning with the rhetorical formula that I mentioned. And the Midrashic dynamic of the text that imitate in its own way the theme of the text. The inversion of the first Nimshal that becomes a secondary Mashal, which in turn becomes a secondary Nimshal, is an inversion of what is expected. You don't expect the first Nimshal to turn into a secondary Mashal, but this in a way is an echo maybe of the inversion of the imitatio Dei that I mentioned earlier. And then we have the movement of the motion of Avelut, because the Midrash makes them disappear. The disappearance becomes here a movement in itself. And the vanishing motions have a double effect. First, by not being present anymore, it makes space for emotion, as I mentioned earlier. But it also makes the reader experience loss as he's reading. The reader is expecting the rituals and the posture, and suddenly the reader is left with absolutely nothing. So there's a sort of an osmosis, if you want, between the theme and the hermeneutical structure of the Midrash. And last, if I were to attempt to leave a little bit the literary and hermeneutical approach that I have proposed and suggest maybe an horizon of a theological reading of that text, I would say that the tears of God is a very well-known theme in rabbinic literature. There are plenty of examples in Midrash, in the Talmud. I've taken one here from Berachot 59a. This is a teaching attributed to a 3rd century sage, and he said, when God shed 2 tears into the sea, and the sound is heard from one end of the earth to the other, it is an earthquake. That creates, if you want, a cosmic rupture. The tears of God create a cosmic rupture. Now, the rabbinic response to that rupture took a little bit of time to be formulated, but in the 11th century, the rabbi established something which was called the Tikkun Chatzot, which was called the midnight mending. It's a sort of a ritual of prayers, tears, and lament at midnight. And Emil Fackenheim, the philosopher, wrote about this. He said, if God weeps at midnight, shall we not wake up at this appointed time and weep with him and for him? In other words, if God weeps, we have an opportunity to join God in his weeping. But our Midrash is going way further than that, because here the divine response is a divine response to the human tears and the human emotion. It is not a human response to the divine tears as we had with the Tikkun Chatzot. There's a sort of an inversion of the motions and the dynamic of the covenant in creating really a human covenant of tears in which, in fact, God is really invited to join. And this is where, from the most minute of human motions, that is the tears, spring forth, I would say, a rather significant and daring theological posture. The tears and the grief from below are calling for the tears and the grief from above, and it is really as if the covenant of our tears was created so that God could join with us in this covenant of tears. So thank you very much. I will leave it there, not to be too long. And I will close the sharing.